So now that we've got our project set up, it's time to get into the fun part, which is calling the WordPress REST API from within our React Native app. So you'll see that I've gone ahead here and I've created a text element, and I've given it the content of my posts, and I've given it the styles heading here to make it bold. And I've also given this scroll view a padding of 10 just to keep our UI looking nice and clean here. So before I can connect to the WordPress API, I am going to install a package called Axios. So I'm going to go to my terminal here, yarn add Axios. And if you're not familiar with Axios, it is a very popular HTTP client for JavaScript that gives you a nice promise-based API for you to make HTTP requests. Makes it very handy to consume APIs like the WordPress REST API. So now that that's installed, I can go ahead and in my declarations, my imports area here, I can go ahead and import Axios from Axios. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go to the very top here, and I am going to import two more items from React, which is going to be use state and use effect. So these two imports, if you're not familiar with React hooks, I would highly recommend, before we go any further, you go and check out the React documentation on hooks. But these two imports are going to help us to manage our data flow within the app. So now that I've got those imports in my code, I'm going to go down here into the body of my main function here, my app function, and I am going to declare a couple of variables, post data, to actually hold the results of my REST query, and set post data. And these are going to be given to me and managed through use state. And I'm going to initialize that state as undefined. So what this line basically says, okay, I want a variable called post data, and the function that I'm going to use to update that data is going to be called set post data. And this is all going to be handled through the use state hook in React, and its initial value is going to be undefined because I'm not going to have that data when this component first renders. And next I can go to the next line and I can create a new use effect hook. And this is where I'm actually going to make my HTTP request. So the reason that I'm using the use effect hook is because this HTTP request is going to happen asynchronously. So it's going to be considered a side effect from the perspective of my React code. So anytime you're using a functional component in React and you're using the hooks method of managing the lifecycle of that function, you're going to want to use the use effect hook every time that you have some type of asynchronous code that you want to run. So within this, within the function, this effect, I am going to go ahead and use Axios to call my endpoint. So I have an earlier video that shows me calling this API endpoint. If you want to see what that data actually looks like, I will put a link in the description here so you can, before we start using the data in this app, you can see what that raw data actually looks like so you can get a better idea of what we're going to be working with. Okay, so Axios gives us a promise-based API, so I can then chain the then operator. So the actual data that gets returned from Axios is going to be on a res object, and so it's going to be called data. And if all goes well, this data will be the actual content of my posts from WordPress. So this is when I'm going to use my set post data function provided to me here by useState, and it's going to take whatever value of this res.data is, and it's going to store it in the variable post data so that I can then use it in my app. And then from there, if I have any errors, I'm going to want to catch them. And I'll just log them to the console. Format this to make it look nice and pretty. And one last thing, when you're using the use effect hook, you need to always make sure that you tell React which dependencies to look for. And you're going to do that by passing an array as the second argument of this use effect hook. And what this does is it tells React basically when to rerun this effect. So if you have some other piece of data, some other variable in your app that this effect depends on, you can put it in this array. If you don't have any other any dependencies, you just pass an empty array, and you're basically telling it, hey, just run this once when the component first renders, and then don't worry about it ever again. Now, if you omit this this second argument, you're going to have basically an infinite loop. The effect will run every single time this component renders, and you're going to have a bad time with that. So always make sure that if you don't have any dependencies, pass in an empty array here. So now I'm ready to actually render that post data to my screen here. So I'm going to go down here below this heading that I created, below this text element, and I can now use this post data variable that I created, and I only want to render this if that variable has a value. So I'm going to use the ternary operator here, and I'm going to say if that post data exists, then because this is an array, I can use the map method on it. And before I forget, I'm going to give my conditional here. If this data doesn't exist, I'm going to render null, nothing. So I'm going to map over each post, and I'm going to create a text element for each of those posts. And if you're familiar with the WordPress REST API, or if you watched my previous video on what the REST API data looks like, then you'll know that each post item, each post object is going to have a title property. So I can call post.title, and then there's a property on that called rendered, which gives me the actual content. So if I run this code, save it, and run it, you're going to see in my simulator that I've got the titles of my posts rendered to the screen. Now you're going to see already here at the bottom of the simulator screen, React Native is giving me a warning that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Now this is very important because what this means is I need to go in here, because this post data is being mapped onto the screen here. React needs to know how to keep track of each of these elements. It needs to know what makes each of these elements unique, so that when it goes to re-render this component each time, it's going to need to know how to keep track of which element is which across renders. And if you don't do this, you could end up with some really weird bugs. So it's a good habit to get into this whenever you're using a loop or a map feature function in your React Native code. So in this case, I know that the post.id is always going to be unique because that's how the WordPress database uniquely identifies each post. So if I hit save there, that error should go away. Okay, so now I've got my titles rendering to the screen. I can see that my request is working. I'm getting the data from WordPress into my app. So what if I, in addition to the titles, what if I also want to render the actual content of the post? Well, I'm just going to go below this in the same map function that I use to render my titles. I'm going to create another text element, and I'm going to have to give this a, actually, you know what? I'm going to refactor this just a little bit. And instead of rendering text as my top level element, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to render a view element. Now in React Native, view is pretty much the most generic container that you can have. If you come from a web development background, you can kind of think of view as sort of like a div. It's just kind of a generic container for other elements. So now that view is my top level element here, I can take this key and I can move it up into view because that's going to be the element that gets the parent element that gets rendered every time one of these elements is rendered to the page. So below this now I can create a new text element, and here I'm going to do post.content.rendered to render the actual content of the post on my screen. Okay, so if we have a look at our simulator here, we can see that the content did render to the screen, but there's one problem. It rendered as HTML. So because WordPress is obviously a web-based technology, the REST API is geared around rendering HTML for web pages. So this is one of the first things that we're going to have to do to get this API to work nicely with React Native is we're going to have to figure out how we can render this content to the app screen and not display those HTML tags. And that's something we're going to cover in the next video.